Hello, today I wanted to talk with you about adaptations for drought tolerance. I know that many of you live in Fort Collins, so this is a video taken at Horsetooth Reservoir on the eastern flank of the reservoir. So first let's survey the landscape. We can gain a great deal of information just by looking around us. So first of all, we notice several things. We notice that the bedrock, these glacially deposited rocks, are right at the soil surface. And in fact, there's very little soil development, which is related to the biomass or lack thereof on the surface of the landscape. We see that there are only one species of tree, a ponderosa pine, and we will look at the forbs more closely, but there are a handful of forb species there, a great deal of bare ground and rock. Also notice that the slope itself is pretty steep, which would contribute a great deal to water running off of that surface. We also see all over these rocks lichens. This is a very special and ancient symbiosis between a fungus and a photobiont. Typically, the photobiont is green algae or cyanobacteria. These are organisms that can photosynthesize. Therefore, they are primary producers, and we can also call these photobionts autotrophs, self-feeders. So the fungus, as we have learned, fungi are chemoheterotrophs, meaning that they eat other food. They eat other chemical food. They do not produce their own. They therefore absorb the nutrients they need from the environment around them. In this symbiosis between a photosynthetic partner and a fungal partner, we find extremely slow growth, but growth in an environment that would otherwise not be able to colonize because of the lack of soil and resources. This is literally the surface of a rock. We can see too, as we move around these rocks, that people like to climb here. There's definitely a lot of bouldering going on, and the lichen is suffering from that recreational impact. Another place where we see a similar situation, where there's something on rocks that we don't even think of as being life. In Moab, if you ever go mountain biking, there's cryptosporidic soils. These are very interesting soils that are extremely damaged by recreational impact. That is a topic for another little mini lecture. So now let's start to take a look at these forbs, but before we do, let's assess this soil condition. What I'm seeing here is very little soil at all. Instead, I see woody debris and needles. Evergreens, Gymnosperms, have unique adaptations to promote survival in extremely harsh environments. So we find that Gymnosperms predate angiosperms in evolutionary history. They're seedless plants, but they are vascular. So typically, we think about plants in a chronology. Early plants like bryophytes are both non-vascular and seedless. And then we move on to vascularity, and then on to finally the development, the evolution of the seed. So these needles, what's so special about them? Why do they never break down? Well, first of all, we already assessed the moisture situation. Not a lot of rain is falling, and whatever moisture is falling is likely running off of this landscape due to the slope. So there's not a whole lot of water. That might contribute to the lack of decomposition. But we also know that needles have recalcitrant material, lignin, inside of them. Essentially what this means is they have produced secondary compounds that prevent their breakdown. They are difficult to consume. Soil organisms have a much more difficult time releasing the nutrients from something like a needle than from a leaf. The other special thing about a needle is that it lives for 6 to 8 years, whereas a deciduous leaf only lasts for 1 year. So if there are very few resources available in the landscape, then it would be advantageous to put your calories and energy resources towards a photosynthetic organ that's going to last for a long time. Let's take a look at these little forbs. I want to focus on the Artemisia frigida. This is fringed sage, and you'll find it all over Colorado in the foothills, montane, and lower elevations in the plains. Essentially, this native species is showing us one key adaptation for drought, which is hairiness. When a plant opens its stoma to accept gases to process into sugars, water is lost. Obviously, water being lost through the photosynthetic pathway is a real problem for plants in this environment. Therefore, the hairs prevent that water loss. When the stoma are open, the hairs are actually a physical barrier from evaporation. On the flip side, in the very early mornings, we find that a lot of the dew is captured and held in these hairs, and so that has a dual purpose in preserving the water resources that are so limiting in this environment. Here we can see these green leaves. These are probably a ribes species. It's a woody plant, shrub-like plant, gooseberry or currant, I'm not sure. But we see that there is some emergence occurring here, even though there are still some patches of snow in the landscape. We also see here a really wonderful display of the lichens that you'll find in Colorado. And now in the lower left, we're seeing prickly pear. Prickly pear is showing another expression. This instead, let's focus on the purpose of being spiky like this. The purpose of being spiky like this is to prevent herbivory, to prevent an organism from eating the fleshy, succulent leaf that is behind all of those prickles. Obviously, that plant organ, the photosynthetic leaf, contains more water than almost any other food source in this landscape. So the development of some sort of protection is important for the survival of this species. Furthermore, you may have seen in your travels that most cacti species in Colorado, they do flower, and they flower in response to moisture. So the flowering isn't necessarily directly related to day length, which signals some plants to start their growing process, but more heavily it is related to the moisture availability. And in alpine plants, we see that when environmental conditions are right, the entire life cycle can be completed in less than 30 days. We see in the alpine and in the arid environment similar adaptations for a moisture signal that starts the life cycle process. Let me just back up for a minute and note that even though we don't think of the alpine as being that dry of a place, that's where all the water falls that flows into the Gulf of Mexico on the eastern slope and the Pacific Ocean on the western slope. All of that water serving so many states and millions of Americans and literally billions of living organisms. All of that water falls right on the continental divide in our precious state of Colorado. However, the snow that falls in the alpine landscape is unavailable to the plants there. Most of that moisture is either running off to the lower landscapes all the way to the oceans, or it is going through an interesting phase change process from solid to gas, which is called sublimation. It is so incredibly windy in the high mountains of Colorado that a lot of the moisture is lost to wind. It just literally evaporates from snow or moisture from rain, and it is lost to the organisms that live there. We can also appreciate here that these species are really living with no soil. As we look at the pine cones, we can also see evidence of herbivory that I was just speaking of. So a different species would likely eat a pine cone than would eat a prickly pear cactus or some other orb. However, we do want to notice the evidence for herbivory on the landscape. So Abert squirrels are obligate to ponderosa pines, and essentially that means they can only live in a ponderosa pine. It is their whole entire niche: food, water, and shelter. You can know when a squirrel is present because the squirrels eat the cones kind of like how you and I would eat a corn cob. The top and the bottom are pretty much not disturbed, but the middle section of the cone has clearly been chewed. Oh, look, this is just wonderful. So we were talking about those early evolutionary plants, the mosses and the ferns, these non-vascular plants. Take a look. You really never see moss anywhere in Colorado except in secret wet places. So again, a testament to the truly amazing survival skills of our sedentary plants. Here, this moss has found a little crook in the rock where moisture pools, and therefore this plant species is thriving. Let's talk about these cones for a quick minute. So I talked about how gymnosperms have naked seeds. What does that mean? Well, the cone itself is a modified leaf. There are only 3 organs in plants: leaves, stems, and roots. The cone itself is a modified leaf, which does protect the seed, but the seed is still considered naked. That's the origin of the name gymnosperm, because it is not protected within an ovary as it would be in an angiosperm. In terms of drought tolerance and adaptation, many cones like this little one here remain closed until some kind of fire event or some forest clearing that allows sunlight to reach the forest floor. At that time, when that environmental trigger occurs, the seeds are released from the cone, and this is why we often find evergreen stands of the same age, because most of the seeds germinated at the same moment or in the same season when the environmental conditions were right. Here's one of those snow patches I've been seeing all around, and you can see that the greenest places are right next to the snow. Immediately, these plants are growing to take advantage of this moisture. This might literally be the most moisture that they're going to see for the whole entire season. Here we also see how slow decomposition occurs. There was a super old log, and it has not decomposed at all, laying on this bedrock. There's more of our prickly pear. Some more germination occurring in that hidden little spot. Well, thank you. I hope that, oh, wonderful, the last thing I wanted to see. I hope that this This little mini lecture has helped you to understand how you can use your eyes as a scientific tool to understanding the ecological conditions on the